Okay, so in this section, we want to start using the React drag and drop package to start adding the drag and drop effects. What I'll do is import D&D provider from React D&D and import HTML5 backend from React D&D HTML5 backend. Keep in mind, all of these packages are already installed had you cloned the starter repo. Inside the grid component, I'll wrap the entire JSX with the D&D provider. I'll attach a backend property setting it to the HTML5 backend. I'll switch over to item.js, and what we'll first do is create the drag effect. I'll import the useDrag hook from React D&D. I'll create a variable for our reference and a method called isDragging, which allows us to determine if an item is dragging. The reference, we'll call it drag, and then we'll use the useDrag hook. Inside the useDrag hook, we can pass additional options. The first option we'll pass is an item, which is required, and it pretty much just describes the data that is being dragged. In our case, we'll set the type to item. Next, we need to monitor when the item is being dragged. We can use the collect method, which is a collecting function. It returns a plain object of the props to return for injecting into your component. We'll pass in a monitor parameter, which is just a tiny state dedicated to each drag item. In our case, we want to determine if we are dragging the item or not. So we'll set isDragging to monitor.isDragging function. Now we do need to use the double exclamation points so that we can turn it into a boolean and determine if it's true or false. Next, we need to actually assign a reference for the drag. So in the parent div, add a ref of drag. If we go ahead and preview, we can select any item on the page and drag it around. Now this isn't all that perfect yet. We have two issues. As we're dragging the item, we kind of have the gray background box around it, and the item itself is staying in its position and not following us. So let's take a look at how we can fix those. Back in our project, we want to edit the styles of the parent div. We're going to set the styles opacity to a ternary operator of isDragging. So if isDragging is true, we'll want to set the opacity to 0, otherwise set it to 1. And if we preview, we can now drag our items around and they disappear from the previous position they were in. Next, let's go ahead and fix that background issue. At the top, I'll import drag preview image from React D&D, and then I'll add the drag preview image component above the drag reference. This will throw an error, so let's go ahead and cut everything and add it inside a fragment. As a property for the drag preview image, I'll need to add a connect property, which will take a connect drag preview. Now this will need a reference, so in the useDrag, let's add a connect drag preview inside our array. Lastly, we need to add a source, and our source will be set to the item visual. Now if we preview, you can see that as we drag, it is a clean image of our items. Back in our project, let's go ahead and switch over to the grid.js. The next thing we need to work on here is defining the block positions. We want to know exactly what block is what in this case. So I'll make some room and I'll create a function called getXYPosition. It'll take an I or an item parameter. And the first variable we'll create is X, which will be I mod 9. 9 because we have 9 items in each row. We'll create a Y variable, which will be math.floor, taking in I divided by 9. Finally, we're just returning X and Y. The next function we'll create is trying to set the X and Y into a block string. So we'll create a getPosition function, taking in I as a parameter, and we'll want to grab what the getXYPosition returns. So I'll do const, and using the structuring, I'll get the X and Y. XYPosition function, be sure to pass in the I being the item we're taking in. I'll create a variable called block, which will set the XY into an array, and then I'll want to return a string of the XY array. Finally, inside of our smart block, we'll create a position prop, which will run the getPosition function. The argument we'll pass is the index. Let's go ahead and jump into smart block, and using destructuring, let's bring in position. Let's go ahead and console log position to see what it returns. And then you can see from the top all the way to the bottom, it's returning the XY position of each individual block. I'll go ahead and get rid of the console log. And now at the top, we need to bring in the use dropped hook from react.js. Like the use drag, this will be the area where we drop our items. I'll create a variable bringing in the is over via destructuring, and then I will create a ref called drop. Using the use drop hook, we are going to accept an item now. Again, remember the item string is coming from the type we defined, which we can drag, so each item has a type of item, which this drop can accept. Next, we're going to use the drop method, which will execute a function once we've dropped a specific item. In our case, we'll do a console log just to retain some information. Next, we want to use the collect method. And again, we'll use the monitor to monitor if the state has changed. And inside this anonymous function, we're going to do something very similar to the drag. So in our case, we'll use isOver is set to monitor.isOver, again, using the 2 exclamation points to turn it into a Boolean. Be sure to assign a reference. In our case, we'll assign a reference to the grid item, setting it to drop. Now, I did mention that we want to console log once we've dropped an item, but in our case, item doesn't really return much information for us. So the place where item is coming from is what our item is here. So if we were to console log, it would just return type item. And to explain this a bit further into detail, what I'll do is add an additional property in our item, and I'll say YouTube and subscribe. So now when I console.log any individual item, it would return any information related to that item. So now you can see that it's returning a type of item and it's returning YouTube subscribe. No matter which item I move around, it will return those values. We'll want to make them dynamic. Now back in our project, let's go ahead and console.log the position and see what that returns. Let's go ahead and preview, and now when I drag and drop the diamond in this position, it provides an A0, showing us the value of the block we're dropping it into. Taking the apple and dropping it in this position gives us a 1, 0, and taking the bone and dropping it in this position gives us a 0, 2. This is returning the X and the Y values of where we're dropping these items into. Back in our project, let's go ahead and provide the item with some detailed information to determine where it wants to land. I'll go ahead and switch to item.js, and we can get rid of this YouTube subscribe property. I'll provide each item with an ID set to item.item, and I'll also provide each item a position. We can also pass the inventory type to determine where that item exists currently. I'll need to use destructuring to bring in the inventory type, so switching to smart block, let's pass this inventory type as a prop to item. And we also want to do the exact same thing for the position. Now back in item.js, we can actually use the position and the inventory type. We just need to make sure that we use destructuring to allow us to use it. Now when we preview and we drag an item, you can see we get a lot more information. We get the ID, the inventory type, the position it came from, as well as the type. If I move the apple, we get similar information, an ID of apple, the position it came from, and which inventory type it's currently in. It's in the chest state. Now if I move the beef, again, same information, but the inventory type has changed. It says that we're currently, or this item currently exists in the inventory state. So this is all very good information for us. Let's go ahead and go back in our project. I'll switch over to the smart block.js, and this console log isn't really serving us much purpose. So what we'll want to do is create a function which will update our immer state so that we can move the order of where our items exist. I'll switch over to the grid.js, and here's where a lot of our functions are going to exist. So we already have the get xy position and the get position. Now we can create a function to update the items. So I'll add a comment letting us know what we'll do. We want to create a function which will grab where our blocks are coming from, and where it's going to be stored. So I'll create a function called move item, which will take in 3 parameters. The first parameter is where it's coming from, the second one is where it's going to, and the third one being the item. I'll create a variable called block from, and I'll just add a string of block, and then I'll use template literals so that we can grab that from value. I'll use the replace all method so that we can get rid of the commas, and I'll just replace it with nothing. I'll do the exact same thing for the to parameter. I'll create a block2 variable, and I'll also want to get rid of that comma. Remember, these are in arrays, so getting rid of the comma can help us here. Next, I want to console log what block from is and what block2 is. I made a mistake here. Be sure to capitalize the T on block2 as I do so here. Now I'll want to access this function, so I'll pass it into smart block via props. And then I'll use destructuring to bring in the move item function into the smart block. And then I'll want to run this move item function whenever the drop is triggered. So whenever we drop an item, we'll execute this move item function. The first parameter it takes is the from, and so I'll add item.position. Remember, this is coming from the item position itself. The second parameter will be position, where it's going to land. And the third parameter will be the item, specifically which item is being moved. Now you can see once I've dropped the item, we get 2 console logs, where it's coming from and where it's going to. And any item we move, it tells us where the item had existed and where it's going to land. This is very, very important information for us, and it determines how we should update our state. So now let's actually work on updating the state. Back into our grid.js, I'll create a function specifically for working with the state to be updated. We'll call this function update item, and it will take in the block from parameter and the block2 parameter, as well as the item. Now this function is specific to our immer state, and what happens here is if we're dragging to a new inventory type, we want to run an if statement. So item.inventory doesn't equal the inventory type. We'll want to update the state. If you're not familiar with immer, I do recommend you looking at the docs because this will make more sense. But what we're doing is we're going to update the chest state, and in immer they provide us a draft, which is a draft state. So we have initial state, we have draft state, and then the final state. So in our draft state, we'll want to update the item.inventory type, specifically the block from.item, setting that to null. So wherever the item is coming from, we'll set it to null. And then what we want to do is update that exact same item to the block2. So I will select draft inventory type block2.item and update it from null to the item.id. Which again, item ID represents the item itself, aka the diamond, the bone, the apple. Otherwise, if we're just moving from the same inventories, I'll just run the update chest state function, again, taking in the draft, which is our draft state that we can edit and manipulate. And I'll set draft inventory type, capturing the block from .item and setting that to null. It'll be the exact same thing for updating the item. Since we're not moving inventory types, I will select draft inventory type block2 for where we want to update the new item and set that to the item ID. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. And I'll want to run the update item function inside our move item function. I'll get rid of these console logs and I'll set the update item, taking in the arguments of block from, block2, and item. Now, if we preview, we can drag and drop any of our items from their old position to their new positions. If we drag it outside the UI, it would just revert back to its old or block from position. Sweet. So now we're just updating the state as we go, and each item is being updated to its new position. Next, we want to take a look at how we can drag our items around while having an indicator letting us know which item it will be dropped into. Back in our project, we can switch to the smart block.js and then utilize this is over boolean. Inside our class name, I'll add a template literal using the is over boolean and using a ternary operator to let us know if it's true or false. If it is true, we are going to add the grid item class with the is over class name. If it's not, it will just be the grid item class name. And now as we drag our items around, we get this light green glow for where our item is going to be dropped into. This makes it much easier for our users to determine where the item will actually land. Back in our project, the final thing we need to add is actually opening and closing our modal. So switching over to the app.js, I want to scroll down into the chest modal component and pass in the open and set open as props. Using destructuring, I'll make sure I bring those props in to our chest modal component, and then we'll create a function to close out the modal. I'll create an anonymous function called close modal, and inside this close modal function, we'll set the state of the opposite of what open is. I'll also need to bring in the audio of closing the chest, so I'll import chest close sound, and I'll create a new audio passing in the chest close sound. Inside the close modal function, I'll make sure to adjust the volume to 0.3 and play the closed chest audio. Finally, we need to take this close modal function and add it to the X icon as well as our overlay. So I'll add an on-click event handler and passing in the close modal function to our overlay, and we'll also add it to our close div. Now, if we go ahead and preview, I can click on the overlay to open and close the chest in the background, but the modal is not actually closing. So you've got half the step down. What we need to do now is import use transition, a hook from React Spring, and A, which is short for animated. I'll create a transition through React Spring, and what this transition allows us to do is determine if our modal is mounted or not, and then run certain animations. So I'll create a transition variable using the use transition hook. I'll pass in open, which is our state, and then I'll pass in null for the second parameter. Now the options we can add are the following. We can use a from, an enter, and a leave. For our from, we'll set the opacity to 0. Our enter will set the opacity to 1, and our leave will set the opacity back to 0. So it starts off with an opacity of 0, and when it's loaded or mounted, it will go to an opacity of 1. Now I'll grab all of our JSX and cut it out, because we need to now map through the transition and then determine on if it is mounted or not, return the JSX. So I'll use transitions.map. Using destructuring for the parameters of item, key, and props, I will return item with the double ampersand and paste in the JSX code. This is letting us know if it is true, then we want to mount this JSX code. I'll be sure to add the a.div to the upmost parent, which allows it to become an animated component. I'll then pass in a key of key, and for our style, we'll pass in props. So now if we preview and open up the chest, you can see that the animation of the chest opens up, as does the modal. We can drag and drop the items around inside the modal and close the chest. You can go beyond this by maybe connecting it to a database or even using local storage to store the user's values of where they decide to place each item. If you did enjoy, please leave a like, don't forget to subscribe, and check out the Discord in the description. There's lots of key information and you can connect with all of the users who are subscribed to this channel. As always, have a wonderful day and take care of yourselves out there.